In the small African town of Kalunzu, a young boy named Nzia lived under the cruel rule of his stepfather, Bokelo. At just 10 years old, he had already lost his mother, the only person who had ever truly loved him. With her gone, his life turned into a nightmare. Bokelo was a greedy and heartless man. He didn't see Nzia as a child. He saw him as free labor, a tool to make money. Every day, he treated him like a burden, never showing him kindness or care. Then, one morning, Bokelo made a decision that would change Nzia's life forever. Without warning, he grabbed Nzia by the arm and dragged him through the dusty streets of Kalunzu. The boy struggled, his small feet barely keeping up, but Bokelo's grip was too strong. He pulled him toward the Kafaru gold mine, a dangerous place where grown men worked endlessly under the scorching sun. As they reached the entrance of the mine, Nzia's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard terrible stories about this place. Men disappearing in collapsed tunnels, workers coughing their lungs out from the dust, and children being forced to work until their hands bled. Tears welled up in his eyes as he looked up at Bokelo. "Please, I don't want to go," he whispered, his voice shaking. But Bokelo didn't care. He shoved him forward and growled, "You will work, or you will starve." Nzia had no choice. If he refused, he knew what would happen. Bokelo had beaten him before. His back still carried the scars. With a trembling body and a broken heart, the little boy stepped into the mines, not knowing if he would ever come out. The Kafaru gold mine was a place of pain, sweat, and broken dreams. It was where men lost their strength, their hope, and sometimes even their lives. And now, it was Nzia's prison. From the moment he arrived, he felt the weight of the place press down on him. The tunnels were narrow and dark, filled with the sharp smell of earth and sweat. Thick dust floated in the air, making it difficult to breathe. The heat was unbearable, turning the mine into a furnace where sweat poured from their bodies like rain. Nzia was just a child, but no one cared. He was given a heavy hammer, rough and cold in his small hands, and forced to work like a grown man. His stepfather, Bokelo, stood nearby, watching him with cold, unfeeling eyes. If he stopped, even for a second, Bokelo would make sure he regretted it. The first time he swung the hammer, pain shot up his arms. He wasn't strong enough. His muscles trembled, but he forced himself to keep going. The crack of stone echoed through the tunnels, mixing with the coughs of tired workers and the shouts of overseers. The work was brutal. The days were long. His hands, once soft, became covered in blisters that burst and bled. His arms ached from swinging tools meant for grown men. The worst was when they made him carry sacks of broken rocks, sometimes heavier than his own body. His knees buckled under the weight, but he knew that falling meant punishment. The older miners felt sorry for him, but they kept their distance. They had their own pain, their own families to worry about. In this mine, everyone was a prisoner. No one could help him. At the end of each day, his body was shaking with exhaustion, his stomach screaming from hunger, but Bokelo took every single coin he earned. Nzia never saw a single piece of his own wages. Bokelo would snatch the money from the overseer and walk away without a word. "You don't need money," Bokelo would sneer. "You live under my roof. You should be grateful." But grateful for what? Grateful for the bruises that covered his back, grateful for the hunger that kept him awake at night, grateful for the stolen childhood he would never get back. He was not grateful. He was angry. Most nights he went to bed without food, his stomach twisting in pain. He could hear the other miners eating, the soft sounds of chewing, the clinking of bowls, but he had nothing. Sometimes, Komoto, an old miner with tired eyes, would slip him a small piece of bread when no one was looking. "Eat fast, boy," Komoto would whisper. Nzia would shove the bread into his mouth as quickly as he could, terrified that someone would see. The dry crumbs stuck to his throat, but he barely noticed. It was the only kindness he had left in this world. But Bokelo was always watching. The night he caught Nzia eating, he dragged him outside and beat him so badly that the boy could barely move the next day. But there was no time for pain. He still had to work. The days blurred into each other. Nzia forgot what happiness felt like. He forgot what it felt like to run, to play, to laugh. His body became thin and weak, covered in scars and dust. His eyes lost their light, becoming dull like the men who had spent their entire lives in the mines. But deep inside, a small flame still burned. He knew he was meant for more. He refused to believe this was the only life he would ever have, and one day he would escape. Every night, after a long day of breaking stones and carrying heavy sacks, Nzia's body was exhausted, but his mind was awake. He refused to let the pain break him. He refused to believe that he would spend his whole life in the dark tunnels of the Kifaru gold mine. Deep inside him, a fire still burned, a small but powerful spark of hope. When the other workers sat together, talking in hushed voices, Nzia listened carefully. The older miners had years of experience, and even though they had lost their dreams, they still carried knowledge that Nzia needed. He pretended not to pay attention as they talked about gold, trading, and the secrets of mining. But in reality, he memorized every word. At first, it was just curiosity. But then, Nzia realized something powerful. If he could understand how gold was separated from dirt, if he could learn how this business worked, he might find a way out. During his shifts, he started watching the workers carefully. He saw how the supervisors handled the gold, how they measured it, and how they transported it out of the mine. He studied the way experienced miners used different tools, how they could tell where the best gold was hidden. He noticed which rocks held valuable gold and which were useless. The more he learned, the more his dream grew. One day, while carrying a sack of broken rocks, he spotted something shiny, a tiny piece of gold buried in the dirt. His heart pounded. He quickly covered it with his fingers before anyone could see. For the first time, he held real gold in his hands. It was small, almost worthless, but to him, it felt like holding his future. That night, he hid the tiny piece under a loose rock near his sleeping area. It was his first secret treasure. But Nzia wasn't just learning from the miners. He also found knowledge in unexpected places. One afternoon, while sweeping near the supervisor's tent, he saw a pile of old newspapers. Most were torn, useless, but one caught his eye. It had an article about gold trading in the big cities. He couldn't read everything. Some words were too difficult, but he understood enough. The paper talked about how gold was sold, how prices changed, and how powerful men controlled everything. His hands trembled as he folded the newspaper and hid it under his clothes. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, he pulled it out and studied it under the dim moonlight. He traced the letters with his fingers, whispering the words to himself, trying to understand their meaning. Night after night, he collected more scraps of paper, more broken pieces of knowledge. He pieced them together like a puzzle, slowly building a picture of a world far bigger than the dark mine he was trapped in. He imagined himself in that world, not as a slave, not as a worker, but as a man of power. He dreamed of walking into the mines not as a beaten, starving child, but as an owner. The thought made his heart race. It felt impossible. But wasn't everything impossible until someone made it real? Nzia knew he had to be careful. If Bokolo or the supervisors ever found out what he was thinking, they would destroy him. They wanted him to be weak, afraid, obedient. They would never allow him to dream. So he kept his secret hidden deep inside him. He worked like an exhausted boy, but thought like a future leader. One day, when the time was right, he would escape, and when he returned, it wouldn't be as a slave, it would be as a king. The day started like any other. The sun had barely risen when Nzia was dragged to the mines, his body aching from the day before. His hands were covered in fresh blisters, his stomach empty, but he had no choice. He picked up his hammer and began to work, just like he always did. The tunnels were darker than usual, the air heavy and thick with dust. The other miners worked in silence, their faces tired and lifeless. No one spoke much in the mines. Talking wasted energy, and every bit of strength was needed to survive the long hours underground. Nzia had been working for hours when he heard it, a strange, deep rumbling sound. At first, he thought he was imagining it, just another trick of exhaustion. But then, the ground beneath his feet shook. A few miners stopped working, glancing around with worried expressions. Then it happened. A loud, cracking noise echoed through the tunnel, like thunder trapped underground. The walls began to tremble, dust falling from the ceiling in thick clouds. Before anyone could react, the earth gave way. The tunnel collapsed. Everything turned into chaos. Miners screamed and ran, their voices filled with terror. The once solid walls crumbled like sand, huge rocks crashing down, sending sharp shards of stone flying through the air. Nzia didn't even have time to move. A massive chunk of rock slammed into his back, knocking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his body. Dust filled his lungs, choking him. He tried to crawl forward, but another rock crashed down beside him, pinning his leg. He couldn't move. He was trapped. The screams around him grew distant as more tunnels collapsed. The dust was so thick he could barely see. His chest burned as he struggled to breathe. His hands clawed at the ground, but the weight on his leg was too much. He couldn't escape. For the first time in a long time, Nzia felt real fear. His body was shaking, his mind racing. Was this how he was going to die? Buried alive, crushed under the very stones he had been forced to break. His heart pounded, but his breaths became weaker. The dust was too much. It was filling his lungs, making it impossible to breathe. Everything started to spin. His vision blurred, and his body felt heavy. The screams of the other miners faded away until there was nothing but silence. Darkness crept in around him. His eyelids became too heavy to keep open. He was barely alive, waiting for death. Somewhere deep inside him, a voice whispered, "Not like this. You are meant for more." But Nzia was too weak to fight. Everything went black. Nzia felt like his body was sinking into the earth itself. The weight of the collapsed tunnel had nearly crushed him. And now, even though he had been pulled free, the pain was unbearable. His ribs ached with every breath. His leg throbbed, and his head felt like it was spinning. He was barely hanging on. Somewhere through the haze of pain and dust, he heard a voice, deep, steady, familiar. "Stay with me, boy. Don't you give up now," the voice said firmly. Nzia felt rough, calloused hands gripping his shoulders, pulling him away from the wreckage. The world around him blurred in and out of focus, but he could make out a face, wrinkled, worn, yet full of strength. It was Komoto. The old miner lifted Nzia in his arms, carrying him like he weighed nothing. As they moved away from the ruins of the collapsed tunnel, Nzia could hear other miners talking, but none of them had come back for him. Only Komoto. They reached a hidden spot outside the tunnels where the air was clearer. Komoto laid him down gently on a rough blanket, his hands moving quickly to check Nzia's wounds. The boy winced as the old miner pressed on his ribs, feeling for broken bones. "You're lucky," Komoto muttered. "Nothing's broken, just deep bruises. You'll live." Nzia wasn't sure if that was good or bad. The pain was so strong that for a moment he had wished for death, just to escape this suffering. But as he looked up at Komoto's face, something about the old man's eyes made him hold on just a little longer. Komoto tore a piece of cloth from his own shirt, dipped it in a small bowl of water, and began cleaning the cuts on Nzia's face and arms. The water stung like fire, but Nzia didn't flinch. He had learned long ago not to show weakness. The old man worked in silence, focused, his fingers moving with the careful skill of someone who had done this before. Nzia realized something. Komoto had probably saved many men in these mines. When Komoto finally sat back, he let out a deep sigh. He looked at Nzia, his dark eyes filled with something the boy couldn't quite understand. Kindness, maybe, or sadness. Then he spoke words that would change Nzia's life forever. "You are meant for greater things, child. Never let this darkness define you." Nzia felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. All his life, he had been treated like nothing, beaten, starved, and forced to work, as if he wasn't even human. No one had ever told him he was meant for anything more than suffering. But here was Komoto, an old man who had spent decades in the mines, telling him he was meant for something greater. That night, everything changed. Komoto didn't just save Nzia's life, he awakened something inside him. Over the next few weeks, as Nzia's body slowly healed, Komoto became his silent protector. He shared his small portions of food with him, making sure Nzia had enough strength to work. When Bokelo wasn't watching, he would slip Nzia extra water or an extra bite of bread. But that wasn't all. Komoto became Nzia's teacher. When they worked in the tunnels, Komoto whispered lessons to him, not about mining as a slave, but about mining as a man who understood gold. He taught him how to spot the finest gold hidden in the rocks. He showed him how the supervisors carefully measured the gold before sending it away. He explained how rich men in the city made fortunes from the hard work of poor miners like them. Nzia listened to every word like his life depended on it. One day, while they were working, Komoto picked up a small rock and crushed it in his hands. A tiny glimmer of gold dust shimmered in the light. "See this?" he whispered. "This is what we break our backs for. This is what men kill for. This is what makes the world move." Nzia's eyes locked onto the gold. It was so small, yet so powerful. That night, after the work was done, Komoto and Nzia sat in the shadows, hidden from Bokelo's watchful eyes. The old man looked at the boy seriously. "Do you want to stay in these mines forever, boy?" Nzia clenched his fists. He thought of the hunger, the pain, the beating, the years of suffering. He thought of the collapsed tunnel, how close he had come to dying. He thought of Bokelo, stealing his wages, treating him like nothing. His heart pounded with anger, with determination. No, he whispered. Komoto smiled, a glint of pride in his tired eyes. Then listen to me, boy. Be patient. Learn everything. Watch everyone. And when the time is right, he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. You will escape. Nzia's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in his life, escape felt possible. That night, as he lay on the hard ground, staring up at the dark sky, Nzia made a promise to himself. One day, he would break free. And when he did, he would never be weak again. On a stormy night when the wind howled through the narrow alleys of Kalunzu and rain lashed against the dusty ground, Nzia knew that this was his chance. While Bokelo, his cruel stepfather, lay in a drunken, heavy sleep, Nzia quietly gathered the few belongings he had managed to hide, a small bag containing a bit of bread, some dried fruit, and a little water. His heart pounded as he stepped out into the darkness, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. Every step away from the oppressive mining camp was filled with equal parts fear and hope. The heavy, relentless rain masked his footsteps as he slipped into the unknown, driven by the desperate need for freedom. For days, Nzia traveled on foot, leaving the suffocating shadows of Kalunzu far behind. The journey was long and unforgiving. He wandered through thick, dark forests, where ancient trees whispered secrets in the gusts of wind, and along dusty paths that wound through small, quiet villages, where the few people he encountered looked at him with a mix of pity and suspicion. At night, he sought shelter in abandoned huts, or curled up under the open sky, where the cold and the constant patter of rain offered little comfort. Hunger gnawed at his stomach continuously, and every step was a battle against exhaustion and despair. Yet with every painful mile, his resolve grew stronger, fueled by the memory of his endless suffering and the promise of a life where he would no longer be bound by the chains of the mine. The physical hardships were immense. His small, tender feet became raw and blistered from walking over uneven, rocky ground, and his body shivered in the cold, unyielding night. Despite these challenges, every hardship only stoked the fire inside him, a determination to break free from the darkness that had held him captive for so long. He remembered the harsh clatter of the mining tools, the cruel beatings, and the stolen moments of childhood that he had lost. All of that pain was slowly transforming into a powerful drive to survive and reclaim his life. Each time his stomach rumbled and his limbs ached, he clung to the belief that a better life lay ahead. After several grueling days and sleepless nights on the road, Nzia finally saw the shimmering lights of Mambika in the distance, a large, bustling city where dreams were said to be made. The city sparkled like a promise, its busy streets alive with the murmur of people, the flash of neon signs, and the constant energy of hope. But as he stepped into the chaos of Mambika, reality struck him hard. Freedom, he quickly learned, was not as simple as it appeared. Here, among the endless sea of strangers, he was completely alone. With no home to call his own, and no one to turn to, the challenges multiplied. He became one of the many souls wandering the crowded streets, a young, homeless boy fighting for every scrap of food and every moment of rest. In Mambika, life was harsh and unforgiving. Nzia struggled to find even a corner to sleep in, often spending cold, sleepless nights in dim alleys or beneath the sagging roofs of abandoned buildings. The city's indifferent bustle was a constant reminder that he was invisible to many, just another face in the crowd. Yet, despite the hunger that gnawed at him and the bitter loneliness that threatened to overwhelm him, Nzia refused to give up. Every small act of survival, a temporary job washing dishes in a busy market, a kind word from a fellow wanderer, or even a stolen piece of fruit, became a beacon of hope. Each of these tiny victories reminded him that he was still fighting, still dreaming of a day when he could rise above his past. Every step on those cold, unforgiving streets was a promise to himself that he would not be defined by the darkness of his former life. Though his journey in Mambika was just beginning, Nzia carried within him a quiet, burning determination to forge a new future, one where hope, not despair, would light his way. Nzia's life in Mambika started with hardship, but he never let his circumstances define him. With no home or steady work, he took up any small job he could find to survive. In the early days, he swept the floors of tiny shops, carried water for vendors on crowded streets, and shined shoes for passers-by. Every job was a struggle, but each one taught him the value of hard work and perseverance. He would wake before dawn and work until late into the night, his tired eyes always fixed on the distant dream of a better future. One day, while cleaning a modest storefront near the busy market square, Nzia overheard the conversation of a local gold trader. The man spoke about gold as if it were more than just a metal. He described it as a key that could unlock great fortune. That conversation lit a spark in Nzia. Remembering his past in the mines, he recalled every detail about how gold was extracted and purified, and he realized that his early experiences might hold the secret to a brighter life. Seizing the opportunity, Nzia approached the gold trader and offered to help as a small errand boy. The trader, noticing the eagerness in Nzia's eyes, agreed to give him a chance. At the gold trading shop, Nzia quickly proved himself to be more than just another street sweeper. He paid close attention to every detail: how the gold was weighed, how its purity was tested, and how deals were negotiated with confident, determined voices. His memory of the mines, the dangerous tunnels, and the precise methods used by the workers became a hidden strength that set him apart from others. Every day after work, Nzia would sit quietly in the back room of the shop, poring over a few tattered books and notes he had managed to collect. He listened to the traders and asked careful questions. Slowly, he began to understand the secret world of gold trading, the delicate balance between risk and reward, and the intricate dance of supply and demand. The more he learned, the more his eyes shone with determination. What had once been a source of pain and sorrow in the mines was now a stepping stone to wealth and success. The gold trader was impressed by Nzia's natural talent and deep knowledge. In time, he promoted him to a helper role, where Nzia was responsible for organizing the gold and assisting in the preparation of deals. With every passing day, Nzia saved a little money from his modest earnings. He lived on a tight budget, often sacrificing small comforts to build a nest egg for the future he believed in so fiercely. Years passed, and the quiet determination that had once kept Nzia awake in cold, lonely nights began to yield results. In his mid-20s, he had saved enough money and built a network of trusted contacts in the gold business. With a heart full of memories from his painful past and a mind sharpened by hard lessons, Nzia took a leap of faith. He used his savings to start his own small gold trading business. It was a humble beginning. A small stall in a busy market, a few crates of gold dust, and a promise to himself that he would never let anyone treat him as less than he was. Before long, the once homeless child who had wandered the streets of Mambika had transformed into a rising businessman. Every obstacle he had overcome added to his strength, and every setback fueled his ambition. Nzia's journey from cleaning shops and shining shoes to owning his own gold trading business became a beacon of hope, inspiring others to believe that even the darkest beginnings could lead to a future filled with light and opportunity. One day, while going about his busy routine in Mambika, Nzia hears a piece of news that shakes him to the core. The Kifaru gold mine, the very place where he spent his childhood in misery, is up for sale. The news floods him with a mix of anger, disbelief, and a sudden surge of hope. That mine, where he was once forced to work by his cruel stepfather, Bokolo, had been a dark shadow over his life. Now, it seemed as if fate was offering him a chance to take back what was once taken from him. Without a moment's hesitation, Nzia begins gathering every bit of wealth he has painstakingly saved over the years. Each coin, saved from his early struggles and hard work, now represents a stepping stone towards reclaiming his past and rewriting his future. In a decisive moment that feels almost like a dream, Nzia uses his savings to buy the very mine that once chained him to a life of suffering. The thought of owning that place, turning its painful memories into a source of strength and opportunity, fills his heart with pride and determination. The process is filled with emotions he has buried for years. The bitter taste of injustice mixed with the sweet promise of revenge turned into justice. The day of his return to Kalunzu finally comes. As Nzia steps off the bus, he is not the same broken boy who once toiled in the dark tunnels. Now he stands tall as a confident, successful man. His clean clothes and dignified bearing create a stark contrast to the ragged child remembered by the townspeople. As he walks through the familiar dusty streets of Kalunzu, whispers follow him. People stop in their tracks, their eyes wide in disbelief. They recall the poor, frightened boy who had been forced into the mines, and now they see before them a man of wealth, a man who has defied his tragic beginnings. Every step he takes is heavy with emotion. With each glance from the astonished crowd, Nzia feels both vindicated and humbled by the long journey he has survived. His heart swells with a deep sense of justice as he makes his way directly to the entrance of the Kifaru gold mine. The very walls that once echoed with his cries of despair now stand as silent witnesses to his transformation. They seem to whisper of a new era, one where his painful past is turned into a foundation for hope. As he reaches the mine, an old, frail figure appears from the shadows. Boccolo. Time has worn his stepfather down. The once cruel man now looks weak and defeated, his face etched with regret. Boccolo can hardly believe his eyes as he sees Nzia standing before him, a man who has reclaimed power from a place that had once been his prison. For Boccolo, it is a moment of unbearable shame and shock, a bitter reminder of the cruelty he once inflicted, and the price he must now pay in the currency of regret. The air is thick with emotions as onlookers watch the confrontation. Some cheer silently, while others stand rooted in disbelief, witnessing the culmination of years of suffering and resilience. For Nzia, this return is not about revenge. It is about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and transforming his painful past into a beacon of hope for others. In that moment, the mine is no longer just a symbol of exploitation. It becomes a monument to his strength and a promise that even the darkest chapters of life can be rewritten. Nzia's powerful return marks a new beginning, a life where he turns sorrow into success and transforms a place of torment into the heart of his empire. His journey from a helpless child laborer to a respected owner inspires all who have witnessed his struggle, proving that with determination, even the deepest wounds can heal and give rise to a future filled with light and opportunity. Boccolo stood frozen, his once powerful body now frail and weak. His hands trembled as he stared at the man before him, unable to believe what he was seeing. The boy he had beaten, starved, and forced into the mines was no longer a helpless child. Nzia, the same boy he had treated like a slave, was now standing before him as the owner of the Kifaru gold mine. Boccolo's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, his voice shaking. You own this mine now?" he stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief. His breath was ragged, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying the words out loud made them even harder to accept. Nzia looked down at him, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had imagined countless times, the moment he would finally stand above the man who had once controlled his life. Memories flooded his mind, the cruel whippings, the nights he had gone to sleep hungry, the days he had worked until his hands bled, the pain, the fear, the helplessness. It all came rushing back like a storm. For years, he had dreamed of this day. He had pictured Boccolo crawling at his feet, begging for mercy. He could make him suffer. He could throw him into the mines, force him to work the way he had once been forced to. He could make him feel the same pain, the same desperation. It would be so easy. The workers and townspeople watched in silence, waiting to see what Nzia would do. Would he take his revenge? Would he punish the man who had nearly destroyed his life? Boccolo, still on his knees, lowered his head. He had nothing left. He had lost everything. He had no power, no money, no strength. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He expected cruelty. He expected to suffer, as he had once made Nzia suffer. Nzia took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists. He had the power now. The choice was his. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of anger, Nzia felt something else. A deep, overwhelming sense of freedom. He had already won. Boccolo was no longer a threat. He was just a broken old man, paying the price for his own greed and cruelty. Revenge would change nothing. It wouldn't erase the past. It wouldn't heal the wounds. It wouldn't bring back the childhood he had lost. But mercy would set him free. Nzia stepped forward, looking Boccolo in the eyes. "I could destroy you," he said, his voice steady, filled with quiet strength. "I could make you suffer the way you made me suffer, but I won't." Boccolo flinched, as if expecting a blow, but it never came. Instead, Nzia did the last thing anyone expected. He turned away. "You are nothing to me now," he said. "Your power over me is gone." The crowd gasped. Boccolo's face crumpled with shame. He had expected hatred, but instead, he was met with something far worse: indifference. He had lost not only his wealth and strength, but also the last shred of control he had over Nzia's life. Nzia walked away, leaving Boccolo kneeling in the dust, his own regrets crushing him more than any punishment ever could. The past no longer had chains on Nzia. He had risen above it. He had chosen something greater than revenge. He had chosen freedom. The sun cast a golden glow over the Kifaru gold mine, its rays reflecting off the dust-covered hills. The once cruel tunnels, where sweat and suffering had filled the air, now stood as a symbol of change. No longer a place of torment, the mine had become a beacon of hope. Its workers no longer slaves to greed, but respected individuals with dignity and fair wages. For years, this place had been a prison, trapping young boys in endless labor, stealing childhoods and breaking spirits. But now, everything was different. Child labor was banned forever. Safety measures were put in place. Every worker was given fair wages, ensuring that no family would starve as they once had. The pain of the past would never be repeated. The people of Kalunzu watched in awe as a man who had once been nothing but a helpless boy now stood as the owner of the very mine that had tried to break him. His name, once whispered in pity, was now spoken with admiration. He had not only escaped his past, he had rewritten it. Among the crowd, a frail, trembling figure stood in silence. Once a man of power, he was now nothing but a shadow of his former self. His hands, which had once held the whip, were now weak and empty. His voice, once filled with commands, was now shaking with disbelief. The world he had built on cruelty had crumbled, and all that remained was regret. The moment he had feared the most had arrived. The boy he had once forced into the mines, beaten and starved, was now standing before him as the owner of everything he had once controlled. You own this mine now," he stammered, his eyes filled with shock and fear. There was no anger in response, no hatred, just quiet, steady eyes that had seen more pain than he could ever imagine. The past could not be changed, but the future could be rewritten. And the greatest justice was not in revenge, but in success. The mine, once a place of suffering, was now a symbol of transformation. The man who had once been feared was now powerless, and the boy who had once been a victim had become something far greater. The winds blew gently over the Kifaru gold mine, carrying with them a new sense of hope. The place that was once filled with suffering was now alive with fairness and dignity. Workers no longer toiled in misery but worked with pride, earning wages that could support their families. The dark tunnels were no longer prisons, but safe spaces where no child would ever be forced to work again. Under strong and compassionate leadership, the mine became the most successful and ethical in the region. Investors and traders respected the name behind it. The business grew beyond the town of Kalunzu, spreading across the country. But more than wealth, it became a symbol of transformation, a reminder that pain could be turned into power. People spoke of the man who had built this legacy. His story became an inspiration to all, especially to young boys and girls who had once feared the mines. Instead of being trapped in labor, they now had opportunities to study, to dream, to build their own futures. Schools were built, homes were repaired, and the town flourished in ways no one had imagined. Among the people, one figure stood tall, watching over everything with a quiet smile. The journey had been long, filled with hardship and pain, but it had led to something greater than he ever expected. He had turned his suffering into strength, his past into a lesson, and his life into a story that would never be forgotten. As the sun set over the hills, casting a golden glow over the land, he took a deep breath and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. The past does not define you. It is what you do with it that matters. No matter how painful your past is, it does not define you. Your choices do. Like Nzia, you have the power to rise above your struggles and create a future filled with success and purpose. Turn your pain into strength, your suffering into wisdom, and your failures into motivation. Never let the darkness of yesterday control the light of tomorrow. The greatest revenge is not hatred, it is success. Take control of your destiny, break the chains of the past, and build the life you deserve. Your story is not over yet. The next chapter is yours to write.